Hi everyone, my name is Kapeesh. Really excited to be here. I work at Coursera as a director of product. So I'm going to talk to you about my experience there. So the talk of the topic is how to make users successful. I'll get into more context on that in a second. Let me start off by just giving you a quick kind of 2-minute elevator pitch of my career so far. So I went to school, studied mechanical engineering and engineering management. So I'm an engineer by training. And then I've been a product manager for the last 8 years. So I joined Zynga as a new grad PM, spent 4 years there working on various game teams, led the Zynga platform team on Zynga.com, and then switched to Coursera, where I spent 3 years building the core product experience or the learning experience. And then for the last year, I've led user growth and monetization there. And when I talk to people about this transition from Zynga to Coursera, people are always surprised, like, hey, that's quite a switch from gaming to education. But in reality, there's actually a lot of similarity. So if you think about what Zynga did, it took games, which used to be $60 packaged in a box that you put into a console and play, and made them free to play, available online at massive scale. And Coursera is trying to do something very similar with education. So these are university courses that were accessible to only a few people, making them available online for free, and trying to reach massive scale with those, and really focusing on how do you make that experience really engaging to actually retain people at a big scale. So I'm going to draw on kind of that experience and the parallels between Zynga and Coursera, and talk about making users successful. So what I'll do is tell you 4 lessons learned based on 4 stories of what I've been doing mainly at Coursera over the last few years. And these stories are very specific to my experience at Coursera. But the hope is that the lessons learned and the principles involved are things that you can apply to whatever it is that you're working on in your work as a PM. Before I go into the lessons, just a quick show of hands. How many of you are already working as product managers? Okay, so a few of you. And then how many are kind of working in non-product roles at kind of consumer product type of companies? Great. That's super helpful context for me as I go through the lessons. So since the presentation is really about Coursera, I want to start by giving quick context about what Coursera is and what a current model is. How many of you have used Coursera before? Okay, almost everyone. So Coursera was started about 6 years ago when Daphne Kohler, Andrew Ng, 2 professors at Stanford, decided to put their CS classes online. And that really took off with hundreds and thousands of people all over the world signing up. And that led to this MOOC movement where lots of universities joined in. Today, Coursera is a 3-sided platform where we connect educators. So we have 160 universities, about 25 companies that offer courses. We have learners, so we have about 33 million learners, and employers. So we have more than 1,000 companies that actually use Coursera classes to train their employees. And so we have over 1,000 companies that are using Coursera classes to train their employees. And we offer about 3,000 courses, and so these are free short online courses, and 10 full online master's degree programs. So we have the whole spectrum of products. So, and really, Coursera is an education platform, but what it really is a lab for behavioral change and experimentation, because our core target audience is working professionals in the age range of 24 to 45, and if you think about that user group, the biggest challenge is you're already working. You want to learn some new skills to make progress in your career. There's a lot of friction and behavior change that you need to overcome to do that. All of you are here today on a Wednesday evening attending this talk. I'm sure there were a lot stronger incentive to go home, watch Netflix, or do something else. That's a lot easier after a tiring day. And that's really the context behind a lot of these lessons that I'm going to talk about. So let's jump in. And feel free to interrupt me and ask questions along the way. I think it's much more interesting if we do that. Okay, so the first lesson is psychology matters. So these are kind of logos of 6 consumer product companies that I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of. What do you think is kind of the difference between the companies on the left and the companies on the right? Anybody? Come on, this should be really easy, other than the fact that the ones on the left are much older and really big public companies.
Those are subscription-based, more users are subscribing.
That's true, although Coursera and Headspace also have subscriptions. Anyone else? Okay, so the ones on the left are really primarily entertainment companies, right? So gaming, social networking, Netflix. The primary use case is you want entertainment or distraction. The ones on the right, it's like meditation, fitness, education. It's much more about creating a new behavior, which is not kind of the natural instinct that somebody has. So there's a lot of similarity. All of these companies rely on forming new habits. So Facebook is incredibly addictive. Netflix is creating this new behavior of binge watching, of not watching television and actually watching video streaming. Zynga relies on kind of daily game playing. Headspace, Fitbit, and Coursera are trying to do the same. They're trying to also create habits, but they're trying to create a very different kind of habit, one that people have a lot of kind of sorry? Good habits, that's right. So good habits versus entertainment. I won't say necessarily bad habits. So when you think about when you think about creating good habits versus bad habits, it's really important to understand the user psychology that drives it. So it turns out that there is a big difference in how people actually form these habits and different parts of the brain that influence these. So one of my favorite kind of bloggers or writers on this topic is this guy named Tim Urban, who writes a blog called Wait But Why. And he's done a really good job of distilling kind of the difference in how good habits and bad habits are formed. And so what he's done is talked about these 2 parts of your brain: the rational decision maker, the part of your brain that governs most of your work function, the part that says like, okay, I should form some good habits, be productive. That's the prefrontal cortex, and the part of the brain that governs sort of your bad habits or natural instincts, which is the lizard brain or amygdala, or what he calls the instant gratification monkey. And so if you think about, you come home from work, you could be taking a class on Coursera, or you could be logging into Facebook or watching a movie on Netflix. It's the right part of your brain, the rational decision maker, that says, okay, you should be on Coursera. And it's your instant gratification monkey that says, no, you can do something that's a lot easier, a lot less cognitive load. And the reason why this is really important is when you're thinking about building a learning product or building a healthcare product, there's a lot of things that you could do to improve the quality of learning or improve the quality of fitness. There's a lot of features that you could brainstorm. But none of that matters if you can't overcome the kind of core kind of forces that are driving your users to actually come into your product or oppose your product. So what you'll see is what a lot of apps do is try to use gamification or different types of nudges or incentives to, even though they're trying to do behavior on the right side, even though they're trying to create a positive behavior, they're trying to use various tactics that appeal to your lizard brain to give you instant gratification, whether it's a quick win, whether it's getting you started with small steps, giving you badges, achievements, and so on, to get you into the groove of behavior change. And if you don't pay attention to this, then it doesn't really matter what kind of core product experience you're building. You're not going to be able to get adoption and traction for your product. So that's kind of one big difference in lesson that I've learned moving from gaming to education. That there's some kind of key differences, but there's also a lot of similarities in how habits are formed. Any questions on that so far? Great. Okay, let's move to okay, so this is one of my favorite quotes about that kind of really captures this insight from this guy named Derek Sivers, who founded this company called CD Baby and is also a venture capitalist, which is, if information was the answer, we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs. So it's not just about having a great experience and sharing the information. It's really about creating the behavior change that drives outcomes. Okay, so the second one is a story about eliminating friction. So one of the classic books on user experience design is this book called Don't Make Me Think, which is a great principle when you're building a consumer product. So with consumer products, people have no obligation to use your product. So if you use a software at work, you need it to get your work done. So you're going to be willing to put up with a lot of friction to learn the product and use it. So think about Excel, think about Jira, think about a lot of other softwares. But if you're building a consumer product, then there isn't that motivation to actually use it. And so it becomes really important for the product to eliminate as much friction as possible and make the user experience in onboarding really, really smooth. So when Coursera first started, we had an experience that followed a session-based model, so very similar to, say, a class at product school. So the experience was fully online, but the classes would start in September, end in December. There was weekly homework, weekly deadlines, and if you fell behind, there were penalties, just like in a college course. If you stayed on track, there were like bonus points and so on. And we saw that this was causing some friction for our users. So whenever we talked to users about what would make their experience on Coursera better, we heard things like this. Life got in the way. They got a new job, so they said, okay, I'll come back to this course later. Or then my kid fell sick, I couldn't complete the homework this week, and so then they dropped off. Our data revealed something really similar. So the y-axis here is the percentage of completers, and the x-axis is days relative to the course start date. So if people started on the day the course started, they were very highly likely to complete. But if they were just a couple of days late, that likelihood to complete went down dramatically. And for a platform that's trying to really scale to millions of users, this was a big problem. So we said, okay, let's take this insight, and most products on the internet are on demand. So Netflix is really successful because it has on-demand streaming, and it's very different from cable. So we said, what if Coursera was actually on demand? And you could start a course whenever you wanted. There was no friction, no deadlines, no homework dates, and you could just learn at your own pace. We would eliminate a lot of friction for users. Everybody would be in this bucket of starting on the day the course started, and we would improve the completion rates for millions of people. So we built this whole new experience that was completely self-paced and on-demand, and we launched it as an experiment. And instead of seeing completions go up and a lot more people sign up for courses, we actually saw completions totally tank, and a lot fewer people were actually completing courses. And so it was really surprising. It's not what we had expected going in. So we went back and talked to people about like, hey, what happened? We solved the problem. Why are you not completing these courses? And this is what people had to say. Surprisingly, it was the exact same things that they cited as reasons for not completing the course earlier in a session-based model. It was still the reason why they were not completing the course. But now the excuse was, okay, life got in the way, but the course is on demand, so I can just come back and learn anytime. I don't need to learn right now. And so even though we'd eliminated the friction for a lot of people, for even more people, we had eliminated all of the forces or reasons that caused them to come back and take those courses. So we took this insight, the insight from this, and said, okay, we probably need some balance. We need to remove friction that prevents people from getting into courses, but then we need to also have a lot of mechanisms and friction to keep people coming back. So we did a series of A/B tests over a long period of time and came up with this experience that we called auto cohorts. So courses would start every week, but everybody had deadlines to keep them going, and they had a cohort that was formed. So they had a group of peers that they would take the course with. And that helped us kind of find the right balance between having a frictionless experience and having enough incentives for people to keep coming back. And so kind of the big, the takeaway from this is when you're thinking about designing a consumer experience, there's this concept of good friction and bad friction. It's still bad to have any friction that gets in the way of people using your product. But what good friction is it might cause friction initially for people when they're trying to use your product, but it eliminates friction from like some other place in their life or in their mindset. So yes, it's a lot of friction to have to submit homework every week, but it also creates this automatic behavior where you know that you have to submit your homework every Sunday, and so you're going to spend time on Saturday or during the week actually doing that homework, and it creates this automatic habit. And it actually enables people to get a lot of value from your product. And so the example I cited was for how Coursera uses this friction. You'll see different products use this friction in different ways. It's not always good to eliminate all barriers to friction. Any questions? Yeah, so what we finally did was, so the initial experiment that we've launched was what looked like on the left. I don't know if you can see the screen clearly, but it was just content was available. People could go at their own pace. And then the final experience was every week there was a new cohort that started. We created a way for people to automatically get grouped with their peers who started around the same time. And we also used a lot of so there were deadlines, but they were kind of rolling. And so we created this feeling automatically of, okay, you're with a group of people. Great. Okay, so the third story is about the power of defaults. So there's this field of economics called behavioral economics, and there's this guy named Richard Thaler who won the Nobel Prize last year. And what behavioral economics says is people are predictably irrational. So in traditional economics, the belief is people make perfectly rational decisions all the time. So you know that working out and eating healthy is good for you, so you'll always do that. But the reality is that that is not how people behave at all. People are really irrational in their decision making. But what's more interesting is you can actually use that irrational behavior to create incentives for people. And using really subtle nudges and incentives, you can change people's behavior for their own good. And so he wrote this book in 2008 where he talks about a lot of experiments where they've been able to use behavioral economics to create better outcomes for health, savings, getting people to pay their taxes, and so on. So I'll just give you one example of a behavioral economics experiment in the real world. So this was an experiment done in England where in a school cafeteria, they wanted to get people to eat healthier. And so what they did was they didn't do any the traditional methodology has been, you educate people about the benefits of eating healthy, the downsides of eating unhealthy, the negative outcomes that you can have. The experiment they did was they simply rearranged the food line so that students could access the the vegetables or the healthy food first, and they had to work a little bit harder to get to unhealthy snacks. And just changing that without any sort of education actually just got people eating a lot healthier, had way better outcomes than any other type of intervention that they had tried around eating healthy. So that's just an example of the power of defaults in the real world. If you've worked in software, or if you've used, say, iOS or any platform, you know how powerful this can be. If the default mapping application on iOS used to be Google Maps. Google Maps had a lot of popularity. As soon as Apple Maps became the default, now Apple Maps is used a lot more than Google Maps now, kind of on average. So what I want to do is kind of tell a story of an experiment that we did that really illustrates how profound this can be. So when we were doing the experiments that I talked earlier around implementing deadlines and friction to get people to complete, one of the experiments we did was around giving people a schedule. So we ran a test with 3 variants. The first variant was a fully on-demand self-paced experience. The second variant was one where the experience was still self-paced, but we gave users an option like, hey, if you want to complete, then we think you should opt into these deadlines and follow the schedule. You're much more likely to be successful. And then the third variant was we didn't give people the choice. We just made the default be you have these deadlines, and we let people opt out in case they didn't want it. And you can see giving people the option to opt into a schedule was quite successful. It had a 25% increase in the number of people completing the courses. But simply by changing the default, by eliminating one step in the story, we were able to improve that completion rate by 60%. So that's like a 2.5 times greater impact on course completions simply by eliminating one step. Good.
How did you come up with these options and how did you test them?
How did I come up with these options and how did we test them? So that's a great question. So, how we came up with these options were when initially we looked at, so the process is, there's like an ideation process, a decision-making process, and then like an experiment design process. So what we did was, I showed the user research earlier. So once we saw the outcome of the on-demand experience, we went and analyzed a lot of the data, and we talked to a lot of users on why they weren't completing. And that led us to form a few hypotheses on, hey, what might be happening here? And so we brainstormed a lot of different things that we could do, right? So there was gamification, there was deadlines, there's kind of having study buddies. There's like hundreds of different things that we could be doing. And then we kind of used the collective wisdom of the team, so like product manager, designers, data scientists, engineers, to narrow down those hypotheses and prioritize them based on what we thought the most successful experiments could be. And so this was one of the, this idea of using deadlines to create that natural cadence of studying was one of the ideas that was around the top of the list. And the reason why we believed in this was because this is how most learning typically happens. So it's a behavior that people kind of know and expect from their time in school or college. And so we thought that the core kind of psychological motivation here would be really effective compared to some of the other things we might do that may be effective, but the likelihood of success was probably lower. So that's how we prioritized this hypothesis for testing. Then there is a step of actually what are the variants that you could be testing. So the first time we tested it, we didn't actually test both of these. We just tested suggested deadlines because we were still really thinking about minimizing friction. So we didn't want to impose deadlines on all users because we thought that maybe by just suggesting the deadlines and getting people to opt in, we could improve the results. So we first tested just those two variants. And then the 25% gain was great, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't what we wanted. So then we again went back and brainstormed, okay, how could we improve the results even more? And we said, okay, what if we actually made this the default behavior? And then we tested that variant. In terms of testing, we invested a lot. We invested a lot in building out an A/B testing platform, which allowed us to bucket users in different experiments and then see how they kind of progress through the courses.
How are you getting feedback from users?
Yeah. So the question is, how are we getting feedback from users? So there's quite a few things that we do to get feedback. So we talk to users a lot. So we have a product research team that is always talking to users, getting feedback on different parts of the experience. Yeah, so we speak to them. So we schedule interviews. So we do kind of video interviews with people for specific products or initiatives that we have. We also do periodic kind of product health checks, where we'll bring people in for focus groups, have them go through the product and actually watch how they're interacting with the end-to-end experience. And then we're also doing a lot of ongoing surveys for different things, so we get feedback for that. Yeah.
So did you test this variance to different user three different courses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, did we test it for users in the same course or users in different courses? So for an experiment like this, we tested for kind of by course. So if as a user, so we didn't do it in all the courses on the platform. We selected a few courses. So it is possible that there were some users that that were taking multiple courses. They had this experience in one course and a different experience in another course. A lot of other experiments that we do it by user. So no matter what course they're taking, they have the same experiment variant therein. And then there's a lot of other experiments we do which are not by user but by session. So at different times when you're coming onto the platform, you could be seeing a different experience. Any other questions? Great. So kind of the big lesson here is, as you're thinking about any product, really thinking about what the defaults are is really important. And as you look at different products, I would encourage you to think about what are the defaults in that product and why the PMs or designers chose those defaults. So there's a lot of I'll give you a few examples of this. So there's a lot of messaging apps out there, but they tend to have different defaults. So for example, if you look at most SMS apps, they will open into a list of messages. But if you look at Snapchat, it opens up into the camera. So the default action they want is for you to take a picture and share it with friends. And that's a really powerful way that they drive that behavior. If you go to Google, it's a really simple page. They really want you to be searching. And so that's the Google homepage. But if you go to Netflix, they really don't want you to search. They want you to browse. They want you to look at recommendations. And so Netflix on your TV makes it really hard to search. It makes it really easy to browse the overall experience. Amazon has really great search, has really great recommendations, really great discovery. And so both of those experiences are kind of reasonably equally weighted. Defaults can really drive a lot of powerful behavior in consumer software. Okay, so the last lesson is loss aversion. And this is kind of an esoteric concept, but the insight from this was really, really profound for us at Coursera. So I'll first define what loss aversion is. So this is the Wikipedia definition of loss aversion. But what it really means is, if I told you that, hey, if you do a task for me, I'll give you $10, you'd be like, okay, that's fine, not really interesting. But if product school said, hey, if you show late for this talk, you'll have a fine of $10, like losing that $10 is going to drive your behavior a lot more. Like you'll hate losing that $10 a lot more than you will like gaining the $10. And this is a really powerful concept that drives a lot of marketing and economic behavior. So how's this relevant to Coursera? So, we're going through this big trend right now where the world is moving towards the subscription business model. So a lot of things that were kind of, you just buy it once and use it for a period of time are moving to a subscription model. So, and this is not just in software, but even in physical goods, right? You can now subscribe to a bed instead of buying a mattress. And definitely in software, a lot of even Amazon, instead of just buying a product, you can just subscribe and you can save. And so a couple of years back, Coursera was thinking about, what does this mean for Coursera? When people come to Coursera, they're looking to learn a specific skill. So they're not really looking to be a member of, and we charge $400 to $500 for a specialization. And people just want to take a specialization. They don't want to necessarily subscribe to all of the content on Coursera. But the overall trends were really interesting, so we wanted to experiment with a subscription model. So the experiment we launched was users that come in to take a specialization. Some of them could follow the old model, which was you pay either $50 per course or $500 for the whole specialization, or you subscribe to it at $39 to $69 per month based on the specialization. And we did this, but we were really worried about how this would affect our users' behavior, because there's all of this data out there that a large percentage of gym memberships go unutilized, right? So there's this racket with gym memberships where a lot of people sign up because they think that it's going to be something they want to do. They want to be fit, but then they don't ever actually use that gym membership. And we didn't want that to be Coursera's business model. We wanted people to get a lot of value from the money that they were paying. But anyway, we launched the experiment to see what would happen. And what we saw was the exact opposite of what we feared. So contrary to kind of the gym model where people pay for the membership and never go, we saw that switching to the subscription model actually dramatically increased the rate at which people were completing courses, the number of people that were completing courses, and the number of people that were then sticking around for months and completing subsequent courses. So we saw almost a doubling of the number of people that were completing specializations and a 50% increase in the course-to-course retention. And that was really surprising initially. That was totally not what we expected. But when we thought about it and talked to users, what we'd really done was completely change the mental model that users had from, okay, I've purchased this course and now I can learn anytime. I have a year to complete this, to, okay, if I don't complete this course, if I don't learn, I'm going to spend more money and I'm going to be wasting my money. And as a result, people that would otherwise have dropped out after one course were learning, and because they were learning, they wanted to continue to learn. And overall, it meant more revenue and more growth for Coursera, and it meant better outcomes for our users. And the reason why I share this is this was a really, really profound insight for us, because we've spent years and years kind of thinking about how do we make a better learning experience, how do we retain people more, what kinds of features might get us like a few percentage points in gain in retention and engagement. But this one really simple change in our pricing model drove a dramatic increase in retention and completion, which we'd never seen before. Way more than deadlines and eliminating friction and all of the other things that I talked about. And so this is probably one of the most surprising, not surprising in hindsight, but surprising at the time, results that we saw, and is something that I think about a lot now. When everything I do, I think about, okay, what's the or when I think about any other business model, I think about how loss aversion could be used. It's not the most obvious one. It's not applicable to a lot of other business models, but it's a really powerful insight. Marketers think about this a lot. Anytime you see a sale happening or a discount or a free trial, like this is what's at play. You want people to sign up quickly because they think they'll lose out if they don't. But I think it's a really useful kind of insight or psychology concept for product managers to think about as they're building products. Okay, so those were kind of the 4 stories that I had. Sure, go ahead.
So, I guess my question is more to do with the global audience that Coursera has. Wanted to understand how did these experiments show results across users across the
Yeah, that's a great question. That was going to be the 5th story that I wanted to include, but I didn't. So the question is, how did these experiments impact global audiences across the board? So I'll tell you a couple of things. Some things that we've done, and then some research that's been done in online learning and MOOCs around this. So the typical Coursera class has a very, very heterogeneous audience, right? So if you take a course in machine learning, you might have someone who's working on machine learning in Google taking that course, and you might have like a high school kid in Bangladesh in the same course. And how they respond to all of these things are very different. There's a few things that are kind of common no matter what the country is. So for example, if you're someone that's paying for a course, you have a very high motivation to earn that credential, show it to a potential employer, And so regardless of what country you're from or what part of the world you're from, they tend to behave in very similar ways. Whereas we see big differences in how, say, high school kids or much older learners who are not really interested in the credential or can't afford to pay, how they behave. So the experiment around subscriptions, it was a lot more successful in Western countries because we had a lot more people actually paying and earning those certificates, and so the financial incentive appealed to them. We have lower conversion rates internationally, and so it was effective in those markets as well, but to a lesser overall extent because there's fewer payers. The experiments around deadlines were pretty universal. So no matter kind of what country you were, like that kind of psychology, that incentive works for everyone. But kind of the second part, which is the research that's been done in the academic sphere around this, is really interesting. So there's this paper that got published last year in the journal Science, and the experiment that they did there was they looked at learners in different countries, and they found that the overall completion rates tended to be, and engagement tended to be quite different based on kind of highly developed countries versus what they called kind of developing countries. And they had a hypothesis that this was due to certain kind of threats that learners perceived if they were from less economically advanced countries. And there were kind of three threats that they identified. So one was called stereotype threat, if I remember correctly. Basically, if you're from say India or Bangladesh or someplace, or if in general you have not had access to great university education, and you're in a course and there's people from MIT and Stanford and other places in the discussion forums, then you might feel really threatened. You might feel like you don't belong here in this environment, and you might be less likely to complete and much more likely to drop off. Or if you're another thing we've seen is if you're a woman, you're a lot less likely to post in the discussion forums. But if you introduce anonymous posting, then that likelihood changes, and you're much more likely to post. And so, based on whether you have that feature or not, completion rates vary. And so then, so we had these hypotheses on these different threats and around stereotypes and so on. And we tried a few different interventions. So one was a goal-setting intervention, which was just having people state what their goal was for taking the course when they sign up, and then we measured what the likelihood to complete the course was. And really interestingly, people that, so that was one intervention before I go into the results. The second intervention was having people say something positive or affirmative about themselves. So the hypothesis was if you get people in a positive mindset, getting them to reflect on something good that's happening, something good about themselves or something good that's happening in their lives, then they might be able to overcome these perceived threats. So they ran these experiments, and the results they saw was these interventions had a really positive effect on learners in less developed countries. So they were able to move the achievement rate or completion rate to almost the same levels or much higher levels as people from the highly developed countries in the control group. But these interventions had a negative effect on people in developed countries. So if you're, say, a learner in the US, you went to a great school, you feel really confident, then going through these experiences made you go like, why am I doing this? This is useless, and you were much less likely to retain. But if you actually needed the intervention, say, then you were much more likely to complete. So there's definitely a lot of nuances in how learners from different parts of the world respond to a lot of these interventions. So it is called, I don't remember the name of the study, but if you just look at, okay, oh yeah, so it's called Closing the Global Achievement Gap in MOOCs. So if you just search for like Science Magazine Achievement Gap in MOOCs, you will probably find the study. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how do you monetize it at the beginning, and how do you put the pricing structure together? You have subscriptions, you also have certificates with prices.
Yeah. So Coursera has a few different monetization models. So on the consumer side, we have courses that are totally free, and people can pay to earn a certificate. You can take the course for free, you can do all of the assessments. If you want a certificate, you pay for it. And in addition to that, we've kind of verified that you've done the assignments and earned the certificate. Then we have specializations, which are basically a series of courses, so typically 4 to 10 courses that are focused on a particular area, so say machine learning, data science, Python, and so on. And all of our specializations are on a subscription model. So you pay a fixed price per month. It varies from $29 to $79. And you can also audit the specializations for free. But if you pay, then you can take the assessments and earn the certificates. And then we also have some kind of credit-bearing courses. So there you earn credit towards the university degree. We call those master tracks or professional certificates. There you pay a fixed price per course. They tend to be a lot more expensive. There's like much more like high touch. So it's like a full cohort model. There's TAs involved. There's academic credit. So there's like proctored exams. And then on the enterprise side, so when companies and teams can go to Coursera and buy a subscription for, say, a team of like 5. It starts at 5, goes up to 100 people, and that is you can buy. It's an annual subscription, so you can pay either $100 for one course per person or $400 for an unlimited use license. I guess the second part of your question was how do we actually come up with this and how do we set this up? So it's something that we've kind of experimented with and tweaked quite a bit over the last 6 years. So when Coursera started, we were just totally free. There was absolutely no monetization. Over time, we've introduced the idea of certificates, and that's really been the main kind of monetization model for most of our life. We've experimented with where the paywall is. So a couple of years ago, we made this change where for specializations, you can only do the assessments if you're a paid user because those assessments are really tied to the certificate. In terms of pricing, how we set the price, why is a Coursera or edX or MOOC certificate $49 or $99 and not $250 or $300? It's just something that we decided a few years ago, and that's become the anchoring for our pricing. We really want courses to be affordable, so we want prices to be as low as possible. We do a lot of experimentation around price elasticity. So what we've tried to do is A/B tests around, is $49 the best price, or is it $89? Is it $25? And we've seen that the moment you increase prices, you see fewer people actually take courses. And so we've done kind of pricing A/B tests to arrive at what we think is the best price for our courses and specializations. We also try to geo-price. So another thing that's really successful for a lot of companies is adjusting your prices based on country. So if you're a learner in India or in certain countries, you see a lower price than average. If you're a learner in countries with much more purchasing power, then the prices tend to be a little bit higher. But pricing is a mix of an art and a science, especially with consumer pricing. There aren't that many products other than e-commerce which have consumers directly paying for either a subscription or a one-off purchase, and so you're kind of always guessing, and you're trying to use data to inform that intuition around pricing.
And quality, how do you set that?
Okay. Okay, those are both really great questions. So the first question is, what are some of the metrics that product teams at Coursera use? So we measure a lot of data and a lot of metrics. So I'll talk through what some of those are, and then I'll talk about kind of what are the most important ones and how do we use metrics to prioritize. So there's there's three main product teams at Coursera. So there's a growth team, there's a learning experience team, and then there is a team that is focused on educators, so people actually making the content. So for the growth team, the main metrics are user growth. So how many people are registering for onto Coursera, how many people are enrolling into courses, and then revenue growth. So how many people are actually converting to paid, and how much money are they paying? So kind of like revenue per user. So those are the top level metrics that we track. And then there are kind of metrics that kind of feed into that. So you can imagine different funnel metrics like bounce rate from the home page, bounce rate from any course page, kind of how many people are converting from a free trial to a paid user, and so on. But the main metrics are registrations, enrollments, and then paid conversion. The learning team really thinks about, so the growth team's job is to get people onto Coursera and get them into courses. And so all of the metrics are really designed around that. The learning team says, okay, once somebody's enrolled in a course, their job is to get those people to complete and have a really great experience while they're doing that and be really satisfied. So the key metrics that they measure are completion rate, so what percentage of people are completing the course. They also look at another metric, which is items completed per learner. So a lot of people actually don't want to complete an entire course. So you're looking for a specific skill, you just want to learn that, and if you've learned that, you're pretty satisfied. And so we also look at, okay, in general, are we increasing the items completed per learner, which means people are using Coursera more and more over time. And then we track NPS per course. So we track NPS for the company overall, but we also track NPS. NPS is Net Promoter Score. The way NPS works is you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this course to a friend, a family member, or coworker? If they say 9 or 10, they're a promoter. If they say 1 to 6, they're a detractor. If you ask 100 people, let's say 50 said that they would 9 or 10, 50 say 1 to 6, then your NPS is actually 0 because you do percentage of promoters minus percentage of detractors. So it's a really stringent metric which measures on balance, like how many people are going to recommend this. And then we also measure course ratings. So when people complete a course, we ask them to rate the course on a scale of 1 to 5. And that's really important for us, that courses have high quality. So those are all metrics for the learning team. And then for the partner team, it's really about how much content can we launch on the platform. So they have metrics around like amount of content created, and number of courses launched, number of kind of videos launched, and so on. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of the question around metrics. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. Now the second question was, a big part of the quality of experience on Coursera really depends on the content. So how do we think about the impact of product versus the actual course content? And so we have a product team at Coursera. We have also a team that's responsible for content quality. So we call it the teaching and learning team. And they work very closely with instructors to make sure that the courses that are launched are of a really high quality. So we inform this in a few ways. So when we do our Net Promoter Score surveys, NPS, we find that the single biggest reason why somebody would be a promoter or a detractor is content quality. So if you take a course with a great instructor, you're quite likely to be a promoter. If you take a course with an instructor that's not great, then you're quite likely to be a detractor. Product does show up in this equation if you have a bad experience with the product. So if the product's not working well, then it will be a reason for you to be a detractor. if the product's working really well, then you really just focus on the course quality. The content's really important. That said, there are quite a few ways in which the product can influence your kind of satisfaction with the content. So, like I was saying earlier, we have a very, very diverse user base. People from all over the world, and then people at very different levels. So, people taking the same topic can be, have very different backgrounds in that topic. So it's really, really important for us to be able to match people to the course that's right for them. So let's say that you come in trying to learn Python. You could be somebody who's never learned Python and you want to just learn the basics of Python. Or you could be somebody that is really, really advanced in Python and you want to learn the latest machine learning techniques with Python. Or same thing applies to, say, courses in business around, say, leadership. We have a lot of courses in leadership, and they all try to address people with slightly different needs. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand, what is the right audience for each course that we've made, trying to understand our users through onboarding, through data collection, and then pairing them with the right courses. And the more successful we are with that in our search and discovery, the better we can have the kind of the user satisfaction with the course be. Because based on kind of where you're coming from, the same course could be a really great course or it could be a really terrible course. Yeah, so that's a great question. What's our strategy around notifications, different channels, how many do we do, what use cases, and balancing a good user experience with moving metrics, essentially. So I would say that in every product that I've ever worked on, that is always a challenge and a balancing act, figuring out, how much do you send. In general, for most products, what happens is, for most of the history of the product, the more notifications you send, the more you're able to move a metric. So, that's why you have this tragedy of the commons with email, where you just have so much junk email from all of these different apps or products trying to get your attention. So, so I'm answering the second part of your question first around how do we balance, and then I'll talk about how do we think about it, the overall strategy. So the way we balance it is you always have kind of a period of, it's an ebb and flow. So you'll have a period where you'll do a lot of experimentation around what are the right set of notifications based on whatever goal you're working on, whether it's user growth or monetization or retention. And then you're always looking at some balancing metrics. So the balancing metrics would be unsubscribe rates unsubscribe rates, email spam filters. If you send a lot of junk email and overwhelm your users, then email systems have become really, really good at detecting that and penalizing you for it. Your users have become really good at penalizing you for it by unsubscribing. So you can use some of those data points to really inform how much is too much. We're always kind of constantly experimenting with not sending email and seeing if over the long term it has an impact. Because a lot of times what notifications do is they just change when the user action happens. So the user might have come back anyway tomorrow and enrolled in a course or paid or whatever the action is. By sending the email, you're just shifting when that action happens. So you can have long-term holdouts to any notification and measure how much incremental impact you're truly having. So the first part of the question was, how do we think about notifications? So we divide our notifications into kind of two very clear categories. The first one is notifications that are intended to kind of re-engage people and bring them back to Coursera and enroll in something or pay for something. And then the second part of our notifications is, once you're taking a course, how do we use notifications to help you make progress? In terms of channels, we leverage email and push notifications quite extensively. We don't really do that much with texting. The way we've come up with our current notifications strategy has been really iterative. So it's really been around having some hypotheses for what notifications we should try, and running A/B tests and seeing not only was that particular notification effective, but also overall is this incremental in the kind of total ecosystem of notifications that we're sending. And so we've designed kind of our A/B tests to be able to measure that. Does that answer your question, or were you looking for something?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
So I have a question about A/B testing. Do you have baseline requirements on how long you should be doing the test, and like how many users you should be doing the test on?
Yeah. So the question is, for A/B testing, do we have requirements on how long we should be doing the test and how many users we should be doing the test on? So one thing that we do for almost all of our tests is before we launch the test, we will do some calculation of, okay, what is our target effect size? So let's say we're running an experiment to improve the registration rate on our homepage. So the numerator for the metric is registration rate, the numerator is number of registrations, the denominator is visitors on the homepage or kind of session cookies on the homepage. And we'll say, okay, our goal is to move that number by 5%. So in the control group versus experiment group, we want a 5% lift. And we know how many people are visiting our homepage. We have that data, so we can calculate to actually detect this 5% lift. How many people will we need in the experiment to detect a 5% change in the metric? And because we know how many people are in the experiment, people are visiting every day, we know how many days or weeks it's going to take to actually measure that effect. The reason why this is really important is there is this idea of experiment peaking, P-E-A-K peak, P-E-E-K peak. So what tends to happen is you launch an A/B test, and due to some random statistical error, you might find that, the experiment had a 10% impact on your registration rate the day after it launches. You get really, really excited that, wow, this is statistically significant, 10% impact, let's roll it out. But that could just be noise. You really want to make sure that that effect sustains for a period of time. Actually, it's not just noise. What also ends up happening is the people, when you launch an experiment, the people that are more engaged with your product tend to be the first ones that enter the experiment. So let's say we're not talking about registration rates, but say Facebook launches an experiment on their newsfeed, right? As soon as you launch the experiment, the people that are addicted to Facebook and are on Facebook all the time are much more likely to be on there and enter the experiment. And so they might actually skew your metrics in one direction. So you want the experiment to run for a long period of time so that you can weed out the effect of those kind of early adopters and know what the long-term impact is. So that's why kind of calculating this, target effect size, how many users you need to have, how long you want to run the experiment before you launch the test is really, really important, just in keeping yourselves honest. Because as a PM, I launch an experiment, I look at some positive data, I'm like, oh man, this is amazing. Let's, roll this out before the data changes, and that's not good for the long-term health of the product. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how long you run the experiment will depend on, the metric, and so if you're talking about non-engaged users, how long do you run? So what we've seen is, depending on the metric that you're trying to move, we have experiments that are significant and reliable in a day, and then I've done experiments which have taken 3 months or 4 months to make sure you get a good read. So working on user growth, we're running an experiment on the home page or certain landing pages. Everyone visiting that page is a new user. You want to measure like an immediate interaction, like do they convert? And you can, you have a lot of people visiting that page, So you can be quite confident that in a day or two, if the effect is big enough or the experiment is successful, the results are going to be reliable. The other end of the spectrum is some of the experiments that I was talking about around course completions. So the average course is 4 to 6 weeks. Some courses are 8 weeks. So to even get an initial readout on the impact, you have to wait 8 weeks, and then you want to make sure that that impact is repeatable and not a one-off. So you want to wait a couple of cycles. So then that becomes a much more longer-term experiment. So it really depends on how many people are entering the experiment and the metric that you're trying to move. So I think experimentation, if you're working with enterprise customers who are asking for features, is always a little bit harder. But let's say you have two slightly different ways of building an experience. There is definitely the possibility that different experiments might conflict with each other if you're running them independently. What we try to do is be really, really careful to think through experiments where there might be those kinds of interactions. Sometimes what we'll do is actually, let's say we have two things we think that might actually interact with each other and negatively or positively affect it. So you have two different things and two different variants you want to try. We'll probably build an experiment with 4 different variants so we can try the different permutations and make sure we isolate the effect of each of those hypotheses. For a lot of experiments that we run, because we have enough users in the ecosystem, we think that that scale will statistically kind of weed out the noise and give us a pretty good read of the impact of each experiment. So even though we have dozens of experiments running at any time, because those are running on a pretty big sample of users, statistically it just works out that you can still get a good read on each individual experiment's hypothesis without needing to worry about the interactions. But it's not always true. You need to have a certain scale for that to be true. Yeah.
So it's very interesting when actually you've got experience in gaming. Have you considered about using some techniques in gaming to motivate users, Coursera, or etc. For example, in gaming when you have different level, gaming when you pass, you probably get a very cool title, really cool profile pictures, or you just get scores. And after you some target, you can get maybe have a virtual gift or a real gift. Have you guys doing experiments about that?
So we've tried to think about so yes and no. So I'll explain that. So the question is, have we tried gamification or things that are really popular in games in terms of driving user behavior in education? So we've done a little bit of experimentation with gaming, but what we've tried to do is use kind of the core principles or the psychology that games use without some of the more cartoony or game type of actual end user experience. So the reason why we don't do the more game-like end user experience is our audience tends to be much more older and serious, and so we don't want to, and our topics are already pretty complex, and introducing a lot of game mechanics on top of our experience we think can be cognitively really overbearing. So I'll give you a few examples of what we've tried to do. So one of the things that games do quite well is use what's called completion compulsion. So they'll use things like levels or experience points to get people to kind of keep playing the game, right? So a lot of games will have this idea of XP, and the more actions you take in the game, the more XP you earn. The more XP you earn, you move on to the next level. And what's really happening there is the game is showing you this progress bar that you're trying to fill and move on to the next level. So when we thought about that game mechanic, there's 2 ways we can implement that. One is we can introduce this idea of Coursera XP or like skill XP. So we show you like your progress towards your progress on Coursera, calculate some score, and have that be the score thing that you're trying to achieve. Or what you can do is use this insight of completion compulsion, which is people always want to, like, if you see a progress bar, you want to fill out the progress bar, and people don't like incomplete progress bars. So we've done things in that latter camp where we've used progress bars to kind of capitalize on people's compulsion to complete. So like when I was talking about this kind of experimentation with schedules and cohorts, we tested just the UI piece of this separately. So we did this experiment which we called the guided learning experience, where we had the same experience with like deadlines and everything, but in one variant we added a lot of like colors and progress bars, and it doesn't look like a game, but it has the same elements, and that was really successful in driving retention. So we've tried to do things like that, but not introduce any like UI or new concepts around games. You have a question?
So like I noticed earlier with this example, the third question, you like a lot of psychological theory that underlies your experiments. But then right now it wasn't clear, like are there things you try that aren't based on that?
Are there things we've tried that aren't based on?
Like a psychological theory? Because here you were saying you tested the theory and the UI, but the UI kind of plays into this cultural theory or trying to catch it. So like, you test, is everything kind of coming from the psychological?
I mean, so so one thing.
Back to like where you get
Yeah. So one thing. So the question is like, okay, is everything we do like really based on these psychological theories, or do we do other types of experiments as well? So one thing to.
You said also like the hypothesis was this. So you always have like a clear hypothesis.
Yeah. So I'll clarify that the lessons learned, I've framed them through like these psychological theories or like user insights. Some of these are the lessons learned like after we did the experiments. The way we do these experiments is we always try to have a very, very clear hypothesis. There's I've definitely seen this happen in companies where it's just you throw stuff against the wall, you see what sticks, and that's how A/B testing or experimentation is done. So you're just like randomly changing button colors and this or that and see if it affects your metrics. We definitely try to avoid doing that. So for any experiment we have a very clear hypothesis of why do we think this will affect people's behavior and what metric do we think will help us measure that behavior, and design experiments which very cleanly try to isolate those hypotheses. We don't always get it right. So sometimes we might have just an idea we're excited about, which may not have a very clear hypothesis behind it, or sometimes you have an experiment where you're trying to combine a lot of different ideas into just one big thing. Then you launch it, you see metrics impacted in a certain way, and then you're like, oh, what actually caused this change? Was it this or this or this? And then you have to kind of unpack that.
Is part of it cultural too? Like,
yeah, I think a lot of it is.
Versus throwing it at the wall versus you get excited about it and then you get it on.
So I think a lot of it is cultural. So both at Zynga and Coursera, both of those companies have had a very, very data-driven and analytical culture, and very deliberately have fostered this culture of A/B testing everything and isolating hypotheses. Companies where there isn't that culture, and it takes a lot of work, right? I think it takes a lot of work in establishing that culture. It takes a lot of work in making sure that new people that come in kind of understand that culture and onboard onto it. Yeah.
A question about how you direct your experiment towards angry customers. Have you ever faced that?
how do we direct our experiments towards angry customers? So we have three types of customers at Coursera. We have learners, we have educators, which are universities, and then we have employers. The latter two tend to be the angry customers, much more so than learners, because they have strong points of view on, how educators, they have points of view on how they want to teach courses. And when you're running an A/B test, you're running the test on their courses. And so they tend to, either be angry or be very happy depending on the experiment. And it's similar with employers. If you're running A/B tests and their employees are trying to take courses, then it can have an impact on them. The way we try to approach it is work with them. So we work very closely with the educators on whose courses we are running experiments, make sure that they understand what we're trying to do, what the impact will be, and bring them on board and have them part of the experimentation. Similar thing with employers. With learners, it's not really been an issue. There's definitely some experiments where, one thing you'll see is that your most hardcore dedicated users tend to also be your biggest critics and angriest users when you're running experiments, because they really love your product the way it is. So any change for them feels unnecessary. And so that's just something that you have to take into stride through user education, through really good customer support, and bring them along. And so long as you're actually creating a positive change, hope that over time they'll actually come over from angry to happy.
All right, we're going to call it there. Let's give a hand to